Welcome back for Breaking the News. I'm Jana Shortle. So concerns growing tonight about the future of Medicaid after the U.S. House passed a budget last night that critics are saying is going to strip that Medicaid funding. Gordon broke down what's actually in the bill and whether that concern about Medicaid is valid.
Yeah, here's why some lawmakers are concerned. This visual here is from the Minnesota Department of Management and Budget, and it shows how federal money is spent here in Minnesota. This large blue square here is Medicaid funding. It's bigger than everything else put together, nearly $12 billion, and any sort of cuts could affect the 1.2 million Minnesotans who are enrolled in the program.
Do a word search for yourself. It doesn't even mention Medicaid in the bill.
If the new budget framework doesn't even mention the word Medicaid, then how could it possibly include cuts to the program? Because many top Democrats claim it could.
Will set in motion the largest Medicaid cut in American history.
Here's their argument. The budget proposal may not cut Medicaid directly, but it requires the House Energy and Commerce Committee to cut around $880 billion over the next 10 years. This committee oversees Medicaid. A graphic created by the New York Times shows how challenging it would be to make these cuts without affecting Medicaid. Each of these squares represents $250 billion. The red squares represent the cuts, and the small number of gray squares represent the amount of money the committee manages that doesn't involve Medicaid or Medicare. You can see, even if they cut everything, there's not enough to cover those red squares.
What we're talking about is rooting out the fraud, waste, and abuse.
Speaker Johnson argues there is enough fraud within Medicaid to cover the difference.
I think it's $50 billion a year in fraud alone in Medicaid. Those are precious taxpayer dollars.
However, some argue the amount of fraud may be exaggerated and may not cover the cuts. Minnesota Congresswoman Betty McCollum recently tweeted out that 14 Minnesota Republicans in the House and Senate sent a letter to Washington because they were worried the budget would hurt Medicaid recipients in Minnesota, saying, quote, "Given some of the large numbers coming out of Washington, we are concerned that there is no way to accommodate some of the proposed massive reductions and still provide the kind of care these vulnerable people require." We reached out to several of these lawmakers, but none of them were available for an interview to elaborate on their concerns. Meanwhile, many Republicans in Washington are saying they will not support a budget that cuts Medicaid benefits for anyone who deserves them.
I'm not going to vote for Medicaid cut. Anything that slashes into benefits for people who are working, I'm not going to be for.
Can you get to 1.5 trillion without cutting Medicare and Medicaid?
I'm not cutting benefits to Medicaid recipients.
So could there be cuts to Medicaid? We still don't know. This budget framework suggests it's possible, but the finer details still need to be hashed out. And many lawmakers on both sides say they don't want to see any cuts to Medicaid benefits. President Trump says he doesn't want to see any cuts to Medicaid either.
Right. It's one thing to say you don't want to, and another thing to see if you have to, which takes me back to that big blue square in Minnesota. Is that the end of the line? We just sit there with this data, or are lawmakers going to be talking about it, Gordon?
Well, and where I actually got those numbers from is a presentation that's going to be given to senators in the Finance Committee tomorrow morning. That kind of explains how the federal budget affects us here in Minnesota. So they're going to be really looking at that tomorrow. And I know Medicaid is going to be a big topic that will come up quite a bit tomorrow morning.
Yeah, so questions and answers tomorrow. Everybody will be in the room?
Yes. Yep.
All right, Gordon, thanks so much.